it's my great pleasure to introduce Adrien Doerig, and one pronounces it Adrian, right?
Yeah.
And Doerig with OE
Yeah.
for the Germans, don't do pronunciation error, like spelling errors in the future. So Adrien is now joining, now coming from the University of Osnabrück, where he was working together with Tim Kietzmann, whom he was joining earlier already at the time at the Blonders. He is working visual perception and using complex machine learning and LLM models and more techniques that we're going to hear about today to study the visual system. He was starting by doing a master's in neuroscience and physics at the EPFL in Switzerland, followed by a PhD in neuroscience under the supervision of Michael Herzog, and then joining Tim Kietzmann. And now the next step for the future years is like to join us here. And we're very much looking forward to you joining us here, and very much looking forward to hear about your work that you've done previously and maybe visions for the future.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming in such huge numbers. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm excited to get to knowing all of you a bit better in the coming months. So as Timo said, a lot of my work focuses on modeling the visual system, and I do use some machine learning techniques for that. And I will show you a recent project that I've been working on that I think might give you a good idea of the sort of skills I have and techniques I use, and then I hope it will be interesting for the Institute. So here's a visual image, and we open our eyes and see it effortlessly. It seems like a very simple thing to do. But in fact, the visual system extracts a lot of very rich information about visual scenes. So this includes object categories such as a cat and a mug and a phone, but it goes way beyond this. It also encodes knowledge about cats. So cats are furry and are likely to make the cup of coffee fall. And it's not surprising, perhaps, that the cat is sleeping on top of the laptop, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of information that the visual system extracts, but if you open a textbook in neuroscience, a lot of what you will learn about vision is centered on object categories. So some of you may know that typically you will describe the visual system by saying there is the ventral stream, and the ventral stream extracts which objects are in the scene. Then there's the dorsal stream, which extracts information about where the object is or how to interact with it, and so on and so forth. This is all, of course, a bit of an oversimplification, but I think it's fair to say that we've been focusing on object categories quite strongly in the past when we study vision. For example, in experiments, we often contrast object categories, and when we do computational modeling, we often train artificial neural networks to categorize objects. But the world is richer than just a bag of categories, as I tried to convince you in the very beginning. Objects are more than their names. So, for example, when you say cat, you know a lot of things about what the cat is likely to do, about how the cat is likely to co-occur with other objects, and so on and so forth. Scenes are more than lists of objects. So if you have a hammer and a nail, that's a very different conceptual, like your visual system will extract something different than if you have a hammer and a glass window. And all of this has been shown through decades of research, and we know that spatial and semantic relationships, scene categories, affordances, co-occurrence statistics, scene grammar, and many, many other things are important to understand visual perception. But one problem, I think, is that it remains kind of unclear how to integrate all of these diverse, rich pieces of information into a unified framework with quantitative and computational rigor. So sort of the big question is, how can we sort of mathematize all of this information in such a way that we can do quantitative experiments? What representational format could we use to quantify the wealth of information that the brain extracts from visual scenes? In this project, we took some hints from artificial intelligence. In recent years, it's been shown that LLMs, or large language models, that are trained on billions of text tokens, are able to capture rich contextual information. So typically what will happen is that you have a piece of text and you can throw it inside a large language model and it will come up with a vector, a high dimensional vector that encodes a lot of information about this piece of text. And this is called an embedding. This is nice for our purposes because sort of baked into this LLM vector, this LLM embedding, there's a lot of information about, for example, where this could be happening, or is it likely that a teddy bear is nearby? So information about what we can expect to follow, and so on and so forth. In addition, it's been shown recently that if you take a language model, you can use it to improve visual models. So you take a visual model, an AI, a language model, and AI, and you can sort of combine them fruitfully. One very well-known way to do this is called CLIP, where basically you have your language model and your image model, and they have to sort of project to the same space. They have to agree with each other, and if you do that, your model becomes better. And that's the case because there's slightly different kinds of information in the two different modalities. So if you sort of you can get the best of both worlds by combining them roughly. And there's other ways to use language models to improve visual models. So to summarize this little part of the talk, we know that LLMs can capture rich statistical world knowledge from training on billions of text tokens. And we know that these LLM embeddings of image captions can be useful for visual tasks in AI. So the hypothesis that we wanted to explore is, could LLM embeddings of scene captions capture the rich information extracted by the brain from visual scenes? Can we use the high-dimensional code of LLMs to capture all of the rich information that the brain extracts that I was talking about earlier? So that's our main hypothesis. To test this hypothesis, we use the NSD dataset, the natural scenes dataset. It's a very large dataset where participants viewed natural scene images while fMRI was being recorded. And there's a whole lot of images. It's a very large data set. There's 3 repetitions per image. And importantly, there are captions for each image. So we have this huge data set of people who saw natural images. We have their brain data, and we know a text description of the images. Yeah? It's not, well, anyway. And then what we do, wait. Sorry, I got confused because it's not the same thing here and there. There we go. So we want to know if the LLM embeddings of the scene captions can help us understand the visual activities in the brain. So for each stimulus in our data set, we can get the brain activity and we can get a caption of the scene. We can take the scene caption and plug it into a language model to get this LLM embedding. In our case, we use this model, and we can discuss this choice later if you want. And then, basically, we want to know if the representations of the large language model are anything like the representations of visually evoked stimuli in the brain. We use several kinds of analysis to do this. I will explain, I will give a bit of detail about how we do this. I'm not sure to what extent you know this, but if you sort of get lost, don't hesitate to ask a question. So we use representational similarity analysis. And the way it works is that we take each experimental stimulus, we get the associated caption, and we get the associated LLM embedding. And we do it for all images, and then for each pair of stimuli, we compute how different their LLM embeddings are. So in this case, it's reasonably different, but not so different. It's both, in both cases, humans doing stuff, for example. And then we need to do this for every single pair of stimuli. Okay, so for each pair of stimuli in our data set, we get the captions, we get the language model representations of these captions, and we see how different they are. And this gives us a so-called representational dissimilarity matrix. And it's a way, basically, of getting a quantitative understanding of the LLM space in this data set. You know that the first two images are quite similar to each other in terms of their linguistic LLM embeddings, but the image 3 and 4 are not so dissimilar, and so on and so forth. Then we need to do the same thing for the brain. So this time we take each pair of images and we see how different their brain activities are. And we do this for each pair of images again. And so now we get a representational dissimilarity matrix for the brain. And we can do this in a searchlight fashion. This means that we take only a little region of brain activities and we build this matrix. Then we move to the next voxel and we make this matrix a bit shifted and so on and so forth. So now we can understand the representational space of the brain at each location, and we know the representational space of the LLM, and we want to know where these things correlate. So we correlate these two matrices. And this is the map that we find. So we find that there is a large network centered on higher visual areas where the brain activity correlates with the large language model embeddings. So just so you can get oriented a little bit, this here is early visual cortex. This is along the ventral stream. This is the so-called dorsal stream, and this is more lateral stream activity. So across a big region of higher visual areas, brain activities are well captured by language model embeddings. And this is not one of these fMRI results where you have to squint and average across dozens of participants. You can see the same effect reproduced in every single participant. So that's nice. You see, we know that in general, the space of LLM embeddings correlates well with visually evoked activities. But we want to know if there is some structure there. For example, it's well known that this area here, FFA, is tuned to face stimuli. Here's another area, PPA, which is tuned to place stimuli. And we want to know if this big blob can be sort of broken down, if we can retrieve these different brain areas. So to do this, we use another method, which is called an encoding model. The way it works is that we take each stimulus, we get its caption, and we get the large language model representation of this caption. And then we train a linear model to predict brain activities from the LLM embeddings. Okay? So we have, for each participant, we have 10,000 images that the participant saw. We take a train set where we will train our model, and we set aside a little test set. On all of the training set, we say, given this embedding, predict each voxel in the brain, and then you train a linear model in this way. Here you can see where the linear model performs well on the test set, and so this recapitulates the areas, the higher visual areas that we found before. But the nice thing is that now with this model, we can predict brain activities based on any sentence that we write, with some caveats. So, for example, I can write a sentence. I can say a bunch of very interested people sitting in a room and predict how my brain would react if I saw this image. The way it works is you write your sentence, you get the LLM embedding, and then you use the model, the encoding model that I just described, to predict brain activities from this LLM embedding. And so we can see if this makes sense. Here I'm showing you a map where I'm contrasting the activities predicted based on this sentence with the activities predicted based on this sentence using this model. So again, to make this clear, we write a text, we use our model, and we predict what the brain would look like if this was being seen, and then if this was being seen. And here you see that we can reproduce well-known contrasts from neuroscience. Here is the face areas, here are body areas, and you see that they're predicted to be more active when this sentence is used than with this one. Here you have a place area and another place area. So it seems to be working to some extent. We tried another contrast, which is to like food areas versus people areas, and these are all areas that have been described recently as relating to food. So there's a structured link between the large language models representations and visually evoked brain representations. It's not that we get a big blanket correlation that's unstructured. We can retrieve brain areas using large language model representations. But how robust is this link? Maybe it's working a little bit, but not well enough that we can retrieve any interesting information from it. To test this, we tried to decode text from visually evoked brain activities. So basically, we're trying to do the inverse mapping of what I just explained. We take the brain responses to a certain image, and we train a linear model to predict the large language model embedding for this image. Okay, so the subject is there in the scanner, they are seeing an image, we get their brain activity, and we try to predict the large language model embedding for this brain activity. And then from that, we can easily get some text. We can decode text from visually evoked stimuli. The way it works is that we take a big data set of 3 million image captions. We take each caption and get the large language model representation. And then we take the closest LLM representation to the one we predicted. And we know which sentence it corresponds to. So basically, long story short, in this way, we can use a simple linear model to decode a text that describes what the person was seeing. And here are some results. In blue, it's the caption that humans wrote. It's a caption from the data set on the test set. So we didn't train on these images. We train on the train set and then we test on this. And in pink, it's the captions that we can decode. I will not go in details, but these are not cherry-picked results. This is an image where it went pretty well, and this is an image where it went a bit less well. So all of this is interpreted to show that the visual system and LLM embeddings are just a linear transform away. Of course, this is a bit provocative way to put it, but you can translate between brain activities, visually evoked brain activities, and large language models linearly to some extent. So linguistic models trained solely on textual data yield representations that can be linearly mapped to brain representations evoked by visually presented natural scenes, showing an interesting sort of linguistico-visual map. This mapping is sufficiently robust that accurate scene captions can be decoded from visually evoked activity alone, and it can capture selectivities of different areas, as I showed you a few minutes ago. So that's really nice. But we want to know a bit more about which aspects of the linguistic embeddings underlie their alignment with the brain activities. What I mean here is, you remember the sentence before, I forgot, a man with a beard smiling at the camera? It would be disappointing if you could get rid of all of the sentence and just keep man and predict the brain activities well. You know, if you just look at this map here, we know that just a face image would get this area here. So we would like to show that it's not just the fact that there is a human in the caption that allows to predict brain activities well, it's the entire context of the sentence that matters. So this is what we're trying to show in this part. Sorry. So this is a bit of a technical slide, so I will try and make it palatable. Let's see how it goes. So we're using this representational similarity analysis that I described in the first few slides to see how different models with different sort of amount of linguistic information map with different brain regions. And the brain regions we have are early visual cortex, the ventral stream, the lateral stream, and the parietal stream. These three are different high-level visual areas. And this is basically the correlation between the model that sees the entire caption, so the LLM embedding of the full caption, with these different brain areas. And then we tried different things. The first thing we did is that instead of using the full caption, we just used the object category names as inputs to our model. So for example, if the caption was a dog running after a cat, we just use dog and cat, and we use that as input. And I think I will skip a bit of details here, but we can get back to it in the question if you want. Basically, if you do that, you do pretty well, but less well than the full image caption. We also tried to just keep all the nouns or all the verbs. And again, if you do that, you do less well than when you use the full caption. And finally, we wanted to know if a sentence is more than the sum of its parts, so to speak. So here what we did is either you take the full sentence and you get the LLM representation, or you get the LLM representation of every single word in the sentence and you average those. So I don't know if you know about word vectors. This is basically using word vectors. The typical example of word vectors is that if you do king minus man plus woman, you will get the word vector for queen. So these things are meant to be sort of added. But if you have the full caption, the model is able to figure out that, wait, there was this famous example. Yeah. If you just have the word bank, it could be the bank for money, or it could be the river bank. So if you just average single words, the context doesn't allow you to disambiguate between the two. But if you have river bank and money bank, you will get different representations in the full caption. So here's our way of testing this. Either you take the full caption here, or you average the embeddings for each word in the full caption, and that's good. Another thing we tried is that, sorry, this is an ugly slide, I apologize. It's the same plot as before, except that these are all many different kinds of LLMs, and they all do similarly. So it's not dependent on the specific model that you're using. The sort of take home for this part is that the good performance of LLMs in predicting visually evoked brain activities can partly be explained by their ability to integrate and contextualize caption information beyond category words or the caption nouns. So part of their success of these LLM models is that they're able to sort of integrate information from all the different aspects of a sentence. They're not just latching on one word, and that's what allows them to predict your brain activity. So that's nice, but it raises further questions, as always. First, I'm claiming to you that what the visual system does is that it takes basically pixels as inputs, and then it's extracting something like a large language model representation. But how easy is this to do? Is it a very difficult task? Another question is, now I've been just showing you different linguistic models, word vectors, sentence embeddings, and so on and so forth. And I'm showing to you how well they match brain activities. But you might be wondering, well, how well would the linguistic models compare to visual models? Usually when you model the visual system, you use a model trained on visual stuff, for example. How can we test all of this in a controlled manner? Well, we turned to training our own deep neural networks. What we did is that we trained networks from scratch on a bunch of images, and the network gets an image as input, and then it processes everything, and it has to predict the large language model representation. So I don't know how familiar you are with deep learning, but you always need to give an input to your model, it provides an output, and you have a loss function. Typically, the loss function that we use in object categorization is you say dog, it was cat, bad, or you say cat, it was cat, good. Here, instead, you get an image as input, it gets processed in the network spits out a predicted full vector. So this is a big vector with 768 dimensions. Network predicts it, and then if the vector is similar to the true one, the one that actually describes the image, it's good, and if it's very different, it's bad, and the network changes its weights. This is a model that allows us to extract, that tries at least, to extract large language model embeddings from pixels. And we're going to contrast it with an identical model, so with exactly the same architecture, exactly the same images, exactly the same initialization, everything is the same. Except that instead of predicting the LLM embeddings. It's predicting object categories as we often do in visual neuroscience. And we're going to contrast these two. We want to know if this new idea of seeing the visual system as extracting linguistic embeddings is better than the traditional idea of extracting object categories. So the way we test this is, again, by contrasting the model representations with the brain using representational similarity analysis. So you remember that's the first thing I described. So what we do is we show all of the images in our data set, and we get in the last layer and time step of our recurrent model, we get the activity pattern for that image. For each pair of images, we see how different these two representations are in the network, and then we correlate that with the brain, like we did in the beginning. And this is what we find. This is all the regions where the model trained to predict these linguistic embeddings is better at correlating with brain activities than the very tightly controlled comparison network that is identical except that it predicts object categories. So if you train your model to predict linguistic embeddings, you do better, you're more brain-like than if you predict these object categories. We wanted to make sure that this is not restricted to the particular kind of neural network that we used, so we reproduced the same results using a different kind of neural network that's very widely used called ResNet 50. Now, I want to pause quickly and meditate a bit about what this means for all the previous results in neuroscience that said the visual system extracts object categories. None of what I'm saying says that it's not true that the visual system extracts object categories. It's just that if you train to predict this complex linguistic embedding, you're sort of extracting object categories and more. And we can try to show this quantitatively by seeing, so we train these two networks. We train the one that predicts LLM embeddings and the one that predicts object categories. And then we freeze their weights. We're going to see if we can find object information in this network and LLM information in that network. So we freeze the network and we see if we can decode object categories from the LLM trained network, and vice versa, if we can decode LLM embeddings from this category trained network. I think I got mixed up, but it's spelled right. And what we find is that you can decode object categories just as well from the network that was trained to predict these linguistic embeddings. Then you can decode them from the network that was explicitly trained to get these object categories. But the converse is not true. So LLM embeddings give you a rich learning signal that sort of gets you object category information for free, so to speak. It gives you that and more. But the converse is not true. Another thing that we asked is, how well does this model that goes from pixels to linguistic embeddings correlate with the brain compared with the purely linguistic model? Right? We would expect that having some visual information in your model should help you model visual activities compared to this model, which is purely linguistic. So again, we can contrast the activities in the visual linguistic model with just the LLM embeddings and see how that correlates with the brain. And basically, the deep network that takes vision as input and outputs this LLM embedding is better than the LLM embeddings it was trained on. So this shows you that it's kind of obvious when you think about it. This here does not capture all the information in this image. I'm sorry, it's very small, but it doesn't tell you, for example, how much space the sea is taking up. It doesn't tell you what's the color of the dog, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of, like, the visual system is extracting this abstract information, but if you want to predict its activities, it's also important to know some more sort of low-level visual, purely visual information. So, yeah.
Sorry, but if it was, so why does still only high-level cortex show up? Because this visual information like color,
Yeah.
the extent and on the retina would be rather a low-level feature, which you would also expect in early visual areas. So why don't you predict there better as well?
So this is just for the last layer, last time stuff. If you do the same with the early layers, then you get an advantage in the early visual area. Yeah. Yeah. So up to now, we were trying to be super well controlled. We were trying to see, I train a model to do what I think the visual system is doing, which is extract this rich linguistic model information. And I compare it with a model that's identical in every possible respect, except in its objective. It has a simpler objective, extracting categories. And we saw that the training to predict LLM embeddings is more brain-like in this case. So yeah. But you might wonder, like maybe both of these models are crap, basically. So I'm showing you that a crappy model is better than another crappy model, potentially. So for this reason, it's important to also compare with other kinds of models that people use in the field. I like to think about it in this way. So you have the space of all possible deep learning models of the visual system, and that's a huge space. And now I'm showing you something extremely well controlled where I just changed one parameter basically in this space. And it gives me a little delta. It says, if you're at this specific point in the space of all possible models, moving this way is good. That's what I showed you. But another way you might want to explore this space is to sample a bit less well controlled, but sample a bit more broadly. So this is what we're trying to do next. We selected, I forgot, let's say 13 different models. And these models were selected to be sort of the ones that people use in neuro AI papers. One that is widely used, for example, is Cornet S, there's ResNet 50, there's CLIP. This one is the best model that you can download on the BrainScore platform, which is a platform that compares lots of different neuro AI models and so on and so forth. And we tried to cover a range of different objectives, like supervised category training, unsupervised models, models that try to categorize the scene type. So, for example, a mountain scene or a room, things like that, or some semi-supervised objectives. So we tried to sample the space more broadly, and we tried to use good models whenever we could. Here I'm showing you a plot that looks new, but it's the same sort of information as I showed you before. The y-axis is this RSA, representational similarity analysis agreement with the higher ventral visual stream, so high-level visual cortex again, for different models. And the x-axis is the training dataset size. And you see that our model, I tried to make it extremely obvious, is in the top left. So basically, it's more brain-like than all of these other models, at least in our analysis. And that's interesting because it's often claimed that the most important aspect to get a visual model to be more brain-like is basically dataset diversity. If you have a more diverse dataset to train your model, you're going to be more brain-like. And at least in this analysis, it seems like if you have a rich enough training signal, you don't need such a varied dataset. So we can talk about it more in the questions, but there's some sort of nuanced debates to be had here. In our case, the LLM model that we use as an objective is trained on lots of text. So it did have a lot of sort of bits of information. But then, if you have a rich learning target, you don't need to see so many images in order to actually be brain-like. Anyway, this result is reproduced in the other higher level visual areas. Yeah. Shall I talk about this? Yeah, I'll talk about it. So
just a random question.
Yeah.
So how would your results look like in a congenitally blind brain? What's your prediction for high-level ventral visual cortex?
Well, so we would put someone blind in a scanner and show them an image?
That's difficult, right?
Yeah, it's pretty difficult.
They would have to read Braille or listen to text.
Yeah. So one hypothesis that I'm interested in is that other modalities, such as hearing, will also end up in a similar sort of LLM-ish rich representational format, and that there will be some parts of the brain where, regardless of if the information is piped in through the eyes or through the ears, you will get this LLM-ish representation in the same spot. I don't know where I would expect that. Maybe it will be, there's some reason to think that it could be at the border between visual and auditory cortex. So that would be interesting. That's one thing I would like to try, actually, to get auditory stimuli, run the same analysis that I showed you here, and see where you get a good correlation between linguistic information and auditorily evoked stimuli.
Do you think it would be different regions than you find here, or do you think there would be an overlap? Because I think
there would be an overlap.
You showed a heat map, and the most power you really have is high-level visual cortex.
Yeah.
I didn't, there was something a bit frontal, but it's not that okay. There's this other auditory cluster there.
No, yeah. So I would imagine, but I'm not sure. But I would imagine that at the edge of the visual system, you might have some sort of actually overlap with what you would get in audition. There's this paper, this line of work by Alex Huth, where they're like, oh yeah, the interface between linguistic and visual cortex, you have this alignment of semantic categories and stuff like that. So that would be argued for something in that direction. Okay, so here's one last control, just to, I don't know, illustrate that we have to be very careful with everything. So the data set we used to train these models is called MS-CoCo, and it's a data set of images associated with captions. And the natural scenes data set that we use for the fMRI is a subpart of this MS-CoCo data set. That's how they got all these captions for all the images. So we made sure to remove all of the fMRI images from MS-CoCo before we trained our network, because we don't want our networks to see the images that then we're going to use the network to predict brain activities with. But still, it means that sort of the images we're training on are part of the same distribution of stuff than the fMRI activities are predicted, are elicited by OCO. That was very poorly explained. So we train on MS-CoCo, and MS-CoCo is a bit like NSD. So you might worry that just training on MS-CoCo gets you good alignment with visually evoked activities on NSD. So one control we can use to sort of check this is we look at the match here on the y-axis. It's the match with different parts of the visual system. And I'm sorry, it's again small. We're comparing 3 models. The first model is the model I've been banging on about. It's the model trained to predict LLM embeddings from images. The second one is the control model that uses the same data set, the same everything, except that it predicts categories. And the third model is another model trained on another data set to predict object categories. And you see that if you predict object categories on MS-CoCo or on this other data set, it doesn't substantially change how brain-like you are, somewhat ruling out the concern that our results are driven by the data set we actually used for training our networks. Yeah.
Wouldn't we want to do the same but predicting LLM embeddings?
On the other data set. Yeah, so the problem is in these other data sets, you don't have captions. Like you just have object categories. So one thing I thought about doing is you take this other data set, for example, ImageNet, and you ask AI to caption the images and then use that. But right now we didn't do it, partly because in ImageNet, you often have the object like sort of at the center of the image. It's not really a scene, like it's not really images of the kind, I don't know, a dog standing on the boat yelling at a cat. It's more like a dog. But we didn't try. But I think the crucial comparison, here is a reproduction of this with a different kind of network. The crucial comparison is that you're predicting category information in these two networks, and the one that predicts category information on MS Coco is worse than the one that predicts category information in the other data set, suggesting that training on MS Coco in and of itself is not sort of boosting your brain match too much.
But currently in the previous figure where the with your model there nicely, then it's trained and tested on the same dataset, whereas the other models will be trained on one dataset and tested on another.
So all of these models are trained on whatever they want, and then we check their alignment with the brain on MS Coco.
Yeah, so that is another difference between your model and the rest of the models compared.
Yeah, but here it's the same thing. Right, so
yeah, but that's the category, not your model. Sorry.
Yeah, okay, yeah. I agree. Ultimately, it would be nice to. Yeah, no, but you're right. Like, it's a good point. Like, optimally, you would like to show that the category trained network on MS Coco is not better than the category trained network on this other data set, which is what I'm showing here. So MS Coco is not driving the whole thing. And also, it would be nice to compare the LLM trained network on two different data sets, which we have not done. So I'm saying good point. We should do it. But that's it more or less. So ANNs can be trained to transform visual inputs into this LLM representational format. Such ANNs are very good predictors of brain data, and they outperform models trained on many more data points. So LLM embeddings are a powerful objective for training brain-like models of visual processing. And one interpretation of this is that they actually model what the visual system is doing to some extent. So it suggests that an outcome of processing in the visual system is the extraction of linguistically aligned representation. The fact that you're better at predicting the visual system when your model is extracting LLM representations and other things suggests that the visual system might be doing that, which is in line with all of the other analyses that I showed you. So general conclusions now, we used many different techniques: representational similarity analysis, linear decoding and encoding, ANN modeling, and more. And all of this converges to provide evidence that LLMs can play a critical role in modeling vision. I just want to be clear that we do not mean that the visual system has language, full-blown language with recursivity and transport and all of these features of language. It's more about world knowledge. By absorbing world knowledge embedded in billions of textual data tokens, large language models converge into a representational format that is aligned with the representation computed by the visual system. So we're not claiming that the reason why LLMs correlate with the brain is that the brain, the visual system is sort of has the power of speech. It's more that LLM embeddings are very good at extracting a lot of information about what co-occurs with what sort of is predictive of what else, and so on and so forth. So it's about statistical world knowledge. So I think this is an exciting finding because it opens the door to many ways of using this framework of embedding linguistic information for studying the visual system. And that's part of what I will be researching when I start here in September. And with that, I would like to thank my co-authors on this paper and the funding. And thank you very much for all being here. It warms my heart.